Good morning, children. Today we are going to read the chapter Indigo written by Louis Fisher. Louis Fisher has written a biography on Mahatma Gandhi by the name The Life of Mahatma Gandhi, and this particular chapter is an excerpt from that book. In this chapter, we are going to read about what convinced Gandhiji to urge the departure of the British. So let's start reading the chapter. When I first visited Gandhi in 1942 at his ashram in Sevagram in central India, he said, I will tell you how it happened that I decided to urge the departure of the British. It was in 1917. So, Louis Fisher tells us that he visited Gandhiji in the year 1942 at his ashram in Sevagram, and there he interviewed Gandhi, and Gandhiji narrated the whole incident of the Champaran movement to Louis Fisher. So here we are going to read an account of that interview that Mahatma Gandhi gave to Louis Fisher. It happened in the year 1917, and it was this Champaran movement that made Gandhiji understand that the Britishers were not in our country for our benefit, but they were here for exploiting us. So that made him urge the departure of the British in the year 1917. He had gone to the December 1916 annual convention of the Indian National Congress Party in Lucknow. There were 2,301 delegates and many visitors. During the proceedings, Gandhi recounted, a peasant came up to me looking like any other peasant in India, poor and emaciated, and said, I am Rajkumar Shukla. I am from Champaran and I want you to come to my district. Gandhi had never heard of the place. It was in the foothills of the towering Himalayas near the kingdom of Nepal. So, children, Gandhiji came to India in the year 1915. On 9th January 1915, he came back to India from South Africa, and this particular day is observed as NRI Day in our country. And in the year 1916, he was just observing the political status of the country, the things that were going around him. He had not participated in the politics of the country as yet. So, in the year 1916, he went to attend the annual convention of the Indian National Congress Party that was held that year in Lucknow, and several other people were also present there. And then Gandhi saw a man coming towards him. That man looked very poor and thin, like other peasants of our country looked during that time. And he introduced himself to Gandhi. I am Rajkumar Shukla and I am from Champaran, and I want you to come with me to my district. So Rajkumar Shukla make a request to Mahatma Gandhi that things were not in the right shape in the district of Champaran, and he wanted the help of Gandhiji to alleviate the sharecroppers from their problems. Gandhiji did not even know about this place Champaran at that time, and he was not much moved by the entreaty made by the poor peasant, and he did not agree to come along with him. Under an ancient arrangement, the Champaran peasants were sharecroppers. Sharecroppers means that the land doesn't belong to you, and you till that particular land. Rajkumar Shukla was one of them. He was illiterate but resolute. He had come to the Congress session to complain about the injustice of the landlord system in Bihar. Somebody had probably said, speak to Gandhi. Gandhi told Shukla he had an appointment in Kanpur and was also committed to go to other parts of India. Shukla accompanied him everywhere. Then Gandhi returned to his ashram near Ahmedabad. Shukla followed him to the ashram. For weeks he never left Gandhi's side. Fix a date, he begged. Impressed by the sharecropper's tenacity and story, Gandhi said, I have to be in Calcutta on such and such a date. Come and meet me and take me from there. So Rajkumar Shukla, he made a request to Gandhiji that he should come along with him to Champaran because the peasants of Champaran were in problem with the Britishers. And Rajkumar Shukla was one of those peasants. He was illiterate but very firm. He had come to the Congress session to complain about the injustice going on in Bihar, and somebody told him that Gandhiji would be the appropriate person to talk to. So he approached Gandhiji. Gandhiji was not interested initially to help this man out, and he told him that he had an appointment in Kanpur, then he had to go to several other places also. But Shukla went along with him. Wherever Gandhiji went, Shukla followed. He followed him to Kanpur, he followed him to his ashram near Ahmedabad, and he always made a request, please fix a date when you can come to Champaran. So impressed by the sharecropper's tenacity, his firmness, his resolution, and moved by his story, by the injustice met to the peasants of Bihar, Gandhiji finally decided to help Rajkumar Shukla. And he said that on such and such date, I would be available in Calcutta. You come, meet me there, and take me from there wherever you want to take me. So from this portion, children, this question number 2 that you can see and think as you read is an important question. Why is Rajkumar Shukla described as being resolute? Rajkumar Shukla is described as being resolute because he wanted Gandhiji to help him, and he did not leave Gandhiji until Gandhiji agreed to it. He followed Gandhiji to the Lucknow session of the Congress party. He followed Gandhiji to Kanpur. He followed Gandhiji to his ashram. And finally, Gandhiji had to give in. So, this all shows that Rajkumar Shukla was very resolute, very firm. Okay, now let's move on to the next part. Months passed. Shukla was sitting on his haunches at the appointed spot in Calcutta when Gandhi arrived. He waited till Gandhi was free. Then the two of them boarded a train for the city of Patna in Bihar. There Shukla led him to the house of a lawyer named Rajendra Prasad, who later became president of the Congress party and of India. Rajendra Prasad was out of town, but the servants knew Shukla as a poor yeoman who pestered their master to help the Indigo sharecroppers, so they let him stay on the grounds with his companion Gandhi, whom they took to be another peasant. But Gandhi was not permitted to draw water from the well, lest some drops from his bucket pollute the entire source. How did they know that he was not an untouchable? From this paragraph again, two questions come. Let's first look at the paragraph, then we'll discuss the questions. So, the due date arrived. Gandhiji finished his work in Calcutta, and then both of them, Shukla and Gandhiji, boarded into a train from Calcutta and they reached Patna in Bihar. Here in Patna, Shukla took him to a lawyer's house, Rajendra Prasad's house. And Rajendra Prasad, by that time, he was a famous lawyer, and later on, he became the president of the Congress party and also of our country. So, Rajkumar Shukla was a regular visitor of Rajendra Prasad's house, so his servants knew him very well. And when they saw Shukla along with Gandhiji, they considered Gandhi also to be another peasant. So the question comes, why do you think the servants thought Gandhi to be another peasant? Because Gandhiji always wore simple dress. He wore like other poor countrymen. So, because of his appearance, the servants thought Gandhi to be another peasant. So, as this Rajendra Prasad was not available in the house, he was out of town. But as the servants knew who this Shukla was, so they allowed Shukla and his companion Gandhiji to stay on the grounds, but they did not let Gandhiji draw water from the well. They did not allow Gandhiji to draw water from the well because they were not sure about the caste of Gandhiji, and they thought if this man was an untouchable, then the whole well would get polluted. So they did not allow Gandhiji to draw water from the well. So the question comes, how was Gandhiji treated at the house of Rajendra Prasad? So you can say that the servants considered Gandhiji to be another peasant. They allowed him to stay on the grounds, but they did not allow him to draw water from the well, considering him an untouchable. Gandhiji decided to go first to Muzaffarpur, which was en route to Champaran, to obtain more complete information about conditions than Shukla was capable of imparting. He accordingly sent a telegram to Professor J.B. Kripalani of the Arts College in Muzaffarpur, whom he had seen at Tagore's Shanti Niketan school. So, first, Gandhiji arrived in Patna where he was not able to meet with Rajendra Prasad. So, he then decided to move to Muzaffarpur, and he knew a professor there, Professor J.B. Kripalani. So, he sent a telegram to him informing him about his arrival. He wanted to meet the lawyers and the eminent people of the place to obtain the complete information about the landlord system in Bihar. Because Rajkumar Shukla was an illiterate peasant, he was not able to give complete information to Gandhiji. So Gandhiji decided to meet J.B. Kripalani and to go to Muzaffarpur. The train arrived at midnight 15th April 1917. Kripalani was waiting at the station with a large body of students. Gandhi stayed there for 2 days in the home of Professor Malkani, a teacher in a government school. It was an extraordinary thing in those days, Gandhi commented, for a government professor to harbor a man like me. In smaller localities, the Indians were afraid to show sympathy for advocates of home rule. So Gandhiji arrived in Muzaffarpur at midnight on 15th April in the year 1917, and he had a warm welcome there by Professor Kripalani and his large body of students. And Gandhi stayed there for 2 days in the house of Professor Malkani, a government school teacher. And Gandhiji comments over here that it was an extraordinary thing in those days that a government servant was giving shelter to a man like him, to a man like Gandhiji, who was an advocate of home rule, who was against Britishers. So, a government employee, a British government employee, showing sympathy towards a person who was against Britishers, that was a difficult scene to be seen. So Gandhiji received a good welcome at Muzaffarpur, and he also got shelter in the house of a government teacher. The news of Gandhi's advent and of the nature of his mission spread quickly through Muzaffarpur and to Champaran. Sharecroppers from Champaran began arriving on foot and by conveyance to see their champion. Muzaffarpur lawyers called on Gandhi to brief him. They frequently represented peasant groups in court. They told him about their cases and reported the size of their fee. So, when Mahatma Gandhi reached in Muzaffarpur, this news that that Gandhiji had come there and Gandhiji had come there to help the sharecroppers of Bihar, then many sharecroppers tried to meet Gandhiji. They arrived on foot or by some conveyance and they visited Gandhiji. And the lawyers of Muzaffarpur also came to brief Gandhiji about the status of the landlord system in Bihar. These lawyers, they were fighting for the cause of the sharecroppers in courts run by the Britishers. And they told Gandhiji about the cases, about the nature of the cases, and about the fee that they extracted from these peasants. Gandhiji chided the lawyers for collecting big fee from the sharecroppers. He said, I have come to the conclusion that we should stop going to uh, law courts. Taking such cases to the courts does little good. Where the peasants are so crushed and fear stricken, law courts are useless. The real relief for them is to be free from fear. So, children, the first line of this paragraph is important. The question comes from here. Why did Gandhi chide the lawyers? Chided means scolded. Gandhiji scolded the lawyers because they were extracting big fee from the poor sharecroppers. The sharecroppers were their own brothers, and Gandhiji felt bad that these Indian lawyers they were charging such high fee for fighting for these poor people. And Gandhiji said that he had come to the conclusion that it was useless for the poor peasants to represent themselves in the courts till they were fear stricken. So, this fear was to be removed from the hearts of sharecroppers, and then only a real fight could be won. So, Mahatma Gandhi scolded the lawyers and he said that going to the courts was useless. Most of the arable land in the Champaran district was divided into large estates owned by Englishmen and worked by Indian tenants. The chief commercial crop was indigo. The landlords compelled all tenants to plant 3/20 or 15% of their holdings with indigo and surrender the entire indigo harvest as rent. This was done by long term contract. So in Champaran, uh, the land was divided into big estates, and these estates were owned by the Britishers, by Englishmen. And our Indian peasants, they worked in those estates. The land did not belong to our peasants. And the chief crop that was grown there was indigo. So all these tenants, Indian peasants, they were given a piece of land and they were compelled to grow indigo in 3 by 20th of the land, that is 15% of the land allotted to them. They were asked to grow only indigo in 15% of the land allotted to them and to surrender the entire harvest of indigo as a rent for the piece of land that was allotted to them. So in rest of the land, in rest of the 85% of the land, they were free to grow anything that they like. But in 15% of the land, they were forced to grow indigo and indigo alone. So this was the contract between the English planters and the Indian tenants. And then what happened? Presently, the landlords learned that Germany had developed synthetic indigo. They thereupon obtained agreements from the sharecroppers to pay them compensation for being released from the 15% arrangement. The sharecropping arrangement was irksome to the peasants and many signed willingly. Those who resisted engaged lawyers, the landlords hired thugs. Meanwhile, the information about synthetic indigo reached the illiterate peasants who had signed and they wanted their money back. At this point, Gandhi arrived in Champaran. So, students, Indian tenants were compelled to grow indigo in 15% of their holdings and they had to surrender the entire indigo harvest as rent. And this arrangement was going on for years and years. Then, Germany developed synthetic indigo, and the demand for indigo, the natural indigo grown in India, fell in the market. So, Britishers did not need Indian indigo anymore. But they did not release the Indian tenants from the 15% arrangement for free. And they did not even tell the Indian peasants that they did not require the Indian indigo anymore. They told the Indian peasants that if they wanted to get rid of this 15% arrangement, then they should pay one time compensation of huge amount. So the Indian sharecroppers, those who had money, they paid immediately, and those who did not have, they could not pay it. They resisted it and they engaged lawyers that this was against the contract that was made years back. And the landlords, they hired thugs, and in the courts, as the courts were run by Britishers, the judges were British, the lawyers were British, then the possibility of an Indian peasant winning over there was least. So, meanwhile, this information about synthetic indigo being developed in Germany, and the these Britishers not needing Indian indigo anymore, reached to the ears of the peasants, and they felt cheated. They felt cheated that why such a huge amount of compensation was extracted from them when they did not actually need the Indian indigo. So they wanted their money back, and at this point of time, Gandhiji arrived in Champaran. So Gandhiji, he began to investigate. He began by trying to get the facts. First, he visited the secretary of the British Landlords Association. The secretary told him that they could give no information to an outsider. Gandhi answered that he was no outsider. Next, Gandhi called on the British official commissioner of the Tirhut division, in which the Champaran district lay. The commissioner, Gandhi reports, proceeded to bully me and advised me forthwith to leave Tirhut. So, in order to investigate the facts, Gandhiji visited the secretary of the British Landlords Association. So, on the one side, we had our Indian peasants, and on the other side was the British Landlords Association. So, Gandhiji felt important to meet the secretary of this association. But the secretary, he denied to give any information to Gandhiji, calling him an outsider. As he did not belong to Bihar, he was referred to as an outsider. But Gandhiji told him that he was not an outsider. Bihar was a part of India, and being the native of India, each and every part of India was his. Then Gandhiji went to meet the official commissioner, British official commissioner of the Tirhut division, in which the Champaran district lay. So the states were divided in divisions, and the divisions were further divided into districts. So he went to meet the British official commissioner of the Tirhut division. And this commissioner also did not talk nicely with Gandhiji, rather, he bullied him and he advised him that he should leave Tirhut, he should leave Bihar at once. Gandhiji did not leave. Instead, he proceeded to Motihari, the capital of Champaran. Several lawyers accompanied him. At the railway station, a vast multitude greeted Gandhi. He went to a house and, using it as headquarters, continued his investigations. A report came in that a peasant had been maltreated in a nearby village. Gandhi decided to go and see. The next morning, he started out on the back of an elephant. He had not proceeded far when the police superintendent's messenger overtook him and ordered him to return to town in his carriage. Gandhi complied. The messenger drove Gandhi home, where he served him with an official notice to quit Champaran immediately. Gandhi signed a receipt for the notice and wrote on it that he would disobey the order. So, the British official commissioner of the Tirhut division had asked Gandhiji to leave Tirhut, to leave Bihar at once, but Gandhiji did not leave the place. Instead, he moved towards Motihari, and Motihari was the capital of Champaran during that time, and he was accompanied by several lawyers. And when they reached the railway station of Motihari, again there was a warm welcome of Gandhiji made by a vast multitude. A very big crowd thronged over there and they welcomed Gandhi wholeheartedly. And Gandhi started staying in a house that he used as headquarters, and from there he continued his investigations. Then he got one report that a peasant was maltreated in the nearby village, that a peasant was being beaten by an English man. So Gandhiji decided to go and see the poor peasant the next morning. So he was proceeding towards the nearby village when he was overtook by the messenger of the police superintendent, and Gandhiji was ordered to return to town in his carriage, to return to Motihari. Gandhiji complied. Gandhiji agreed to it. And there Gandhiji was served an official notice from the side of the police superintendent telling him to quit Champaran immediately. Gandhi signed a receipt for the notice, that he received the notice, and he also wrote on the receipt that he would disobey this order. He would not oblige to this order. So, as a result of it, Gandhiji received a summons to appear in court the next day. So, as Gandhiji defied the order of the police superintendent, a summons was served to him to appear in the court the next day. All night Gandhi remained awake. He telegraphed Rajendra Prasad to come from Bihar with influential friends. He sent instructions to the ashram. He wired a full report to the viceroy. So Gandhiji made preparations that particular night by staying awake. He telegraphed Rajendra Prasad to come to that place immediately along with some influential friends. And he also sent instructions to his ashram in Gujarat about the several things to be done over there. And the complete report of the whole matter he telegraphed to the viceroy. So next morning what happened? Morning found the town of Motihari black with peasants. They did not know Gandhi's record in South Africa. They had merely heard that a Mahatma who wanted to help them was in trouble with the authorities. Their spontaneous demonstration in thousands around the courthouse was the beginning of their liberation from fear of the British. The officials felt powerless without Gandhi's cooperation. He helped them regulate the crowd. He was polite and friendly. He was giving them concrete proof that their might, hitherto dreaded and unquestioned, could be challenged by Indians. The government was baffled. The prosecutor requested the judge to postpone the trial. Apparently, the authorities wished to consult their superiors. So the next morning dawned in a very new color. These Britishers, they had the intention of arresting Gandhiji and putting him behind the bars, but that particular morning when Gandhiji was supposed to appear in the court was surrounded by thousands of peasants. These peasants did not know who Mahatma Gandhi was and what was his record in South Africa. They only knew that a Mahatma had come to Champaran to help them and he himself was in problem. So in order to help Gandhiji, they all gathered around the court. They surrounded the court from all the sides and they were demonstrating and they were asking for the release of Gandhiji. And inside the court, there were a handful of officials. The judge, the prosecutor, the British lawyer, they all were baffled. They all were confused. They had never seen such a thing before. So the government was baffled and they were not able to control the crowd. They needed the help of Gandhiji and Gandhiji gave full cooperation. Gandhiji was very polite and friendly and he helped the British officials in regulating the crowd. He talked to the people and asked them to be calm and quiet. And Gandhiji gave them a concrete evidence that the might, the power of Britishers, though in the past it was dreaded, it was feared, and it was unquestioned, but that particular day, their might, their power was questioned, was challenged by Indians. The British lawyer, the prosecutor, requested the judge to postpone the trial, to have it on some other day. So it was clear that the British judge and prosecutor, they wanted to consult their superiors. They did not know what to do in the matter. If they made a judgment of arresting Gandhiji, then the public would go violent and would kill them. So they were scared to pass any judgment. So the trial was delayed and Gandhiji protested against it. And then he read a statement pleading guilty. He was involved, he told the court, in a conflict of duties. This is another important question, children. What was the conflict of duties faced by Gandhiji? So Gandhiji in the court, he read out his conflict of duties. First, let me read it. On the one hand, not to set a bad example as a lawbreaker. On the other hand, to render the humanitarian and national service for which he had come. He disregarded the order to leave, not for want of respect for lawful authority, but in obedience to the higher law of our being, the voice of conscience. He asked the penalty due. So Gandhiji read out his conflict of duties. He was telling that being an advocate himself, he respected law and he did not want to set a bad example as a lawbreaker. But then he had come to that place to help the poor people. So he was doing something out of humanity and out of being an Indian. So another Indian needed his help, so he had come there to help him. So he said that there was no dearth of respect in him for law, but he was defying the orders to quit Champaran because he wanted to be obedient to the higher law of our being, and that is our inner conscience. His conscience, Gandhiji's conscience, was not allowing him to leave Champaran. His inner self was telling him to stay there and to help the poor peasants. So, because of that, he was staying there. So, this was the conflict of duties. On the one hand, he did not want to break any law. On the other hand, he wanted to help the peasants, and he was put in a very difficult situation by the notice served by the police superintendent, and he did not know what to do, and he listened to his inner conscience and he stayed in Champaran. So he asked the penalty due, that if he had done something wrong by not abiding by the notice that was served to him, so whatever was the penalty due, he would pay. He asked for it. The magistrate announced that he would pronounce sentence after a 2-hour recess and asked Gandhi to furnish bail for those 120 minutes. Gandhi refused. The judge released him without bail. When the court reconvened, the judge said he would not deliver the judgment for several days. Meanwhile, he allowed Gandhi to remain at liberty. So the magistrate, he was finding it difficult to pronounce the judgment. So he said that a 2-hour recess would be taken, and after that the sentence would be pronounced, for which Gandhi was supposed to furnish bail, to pay money for those 120 minutes, for those 2 hours. Gandhiji refused. Gandhiji said that the delay was from the side of the magistrate and not him, so he would not pay any bail. So the magistrate released him without bail. And after 2 hours, the court reconvened, and there the judge again said that he would not deliver the judgment for several days, and Gandhiji was set free. That Gandhiji could stay in Champaran till the judgment was passed. So Gandhiji was set free. Rajendra Prasad, Brij Kishore Babu, Maulana Mazharul Haq, and several other prominent lawyers had arrived from Bihar. They conferred with Gandhi. What would they do if he was sentenced to prison? Gandhi asked. Why? The senior lawyer replied they had come to advise and help him. If he went to jail, there would be nobody to advise and they would go home. What about the injustice to the sharecroppers? Gandhi demanded. The lawyers withdrew to consult. Rajendra Prasad has recorded the upshot of their consultations. They thought amongst themselves that Gandhi was totally a stranger, and yet he was prepared to go to prison for the sake of the peasants. If they, on the other hand, being not only residents of the adjoining districts, but also those who claim to have served these peasants, should go home, it would be shameful desertion. So, in the coming days, Gandhiji had a meeting with the several prominent lawyers of the area, including Rajendra Prasad, Brij Kishore Babu, Maulana Mazharul Haq, and they all were discussing about the fate of Gandhiji. As the case was not withdrawn, the magistrate said to pronounce the judgment after a few days. So they were all thinking what would be the modus operandi if Gandhiji was arrested, what they would do. So one of the senior lawyer replied that they would go back. If Gandhiji would go to jail, then who would be the leader amongst them? Nobody. So they would not be able to do anything and they would go home. And Gandhiji was quite upset with this answer. He asked these lawyers what would they do if he was sentenced to prison. And to that, the senior lawyer replied that they would go home. But then all the lawyers, they went in one corner and they had consultations. They discussed the matter and they thought amongst themselves that Gandhiji did not belong to Champaran, but still he was ready to go to prison for these peasants. And we who not only belonged to the adjoining districts but also were taking a lot of fee from these poor peasants. So our duty towards these peasants was more than Gandhiji's. And Gandhiji, being a stranger, was willing to go to jail. Then why were they hesitating? So they decided that they would be with Gandhi, and if Gandhi would be arrested, they would also court arrest. So this comes in the next paragraph. They accordingly went back to Gandhi and told him they were ready to follow him into jail. The battle of Champaran is won, he exclaimed. Then he took a piece of paper and divided the group into pairs and put down the order in which each pair was to court arrest. So these lawyers, they went to Gandhi and told him that they were with him, and if he was arrested then they would also court arrest. So Gandhi to this exclaimed with happiness that the battle of Champaran is won. If you are able to come along with me to jail, if you are ready to go to that extent, then definitely we are going to win. And then Gandhiji drew the proper plan that in what manner, how many lawyers would court arrest from time to time. Several days later, Gandhi received a written communication from the magistrate informing him that the lieutenant governor of the province had ordered the case to be dropped. Civil disobedience had triumphed the first time in modern India. So several days later, Gandhiji received a written communication from the magistrate, a letter from the magistrate from the judge informing that the case against him was dropped and he was at liberty to move about in Champaran. So Gandhiji called this as the first victory of civil disobedience in modern India. In our country, this was the first instance when public rose against the government, and as a result of it, the government had to go on back foot. So this was the first victory, first triumph of civil disobedience in our country. Gandhiji and the lawyers now proceeded to conduct a far-flung inquiry into the grievances of the farmers. Depositions by about 10,000 peasants were written down and notes made on other evidence. Documents were collected, the whole area throbbed with the activity of the investigators and the vehement protest of the landlords. So Gandhiji and the lawyers, they conducted a deep inquiry, a thorough inquiry into the grievances of the farmers. And as many as 10,000 peasants came forward and they submitted written documents as an evidence to Gandhiji and the lawyers. So all these documents were collected, notes on several evidences were made, and so this whole area was throbbing, was full of this activity of the investigation and protests against the landlords. So as a result of this, in June, Gandhi was summoned to Sir Edward Gate, the Lieutenant Governor. Before he went, he met leading associates and again laid detailed plans for civil disobedience if he should not return. So Gandhiji was called by Sir Edward Gate, the Lieutenant Governor, to his office, and Gandhiji made a plan that if he would not return, then what his subordinates were supposed to do. But Gandhiji was not arrested by the Lieutenant Governor. Rather, Gandhiji had four protracted means prolonged, you can say a very deliberate, a long interview with the Lieutenant Governor. He had four such extended interviews with the Lieutenant Governor, and as a result of these interviews, an official commission of inquiry into the indigo sharecropper situation was appointed. And in this commission, the members were landlords or British government officials, and Gandhiji was the sole representative of the peasants. From peasant side, there was only one person who was representing them, and that person was Gandhiji. Gandhiji remained in Champaran for an initial uninterrupted period of 7 months and then again for several shorter visits. The visit undertaken casually on the entreaty of an unlettered peasant in the expectation that it would last a few days occupied almost a year of Gandhi's life. So Gandhi stayed in Champaran initially continuously for 7 months and then again for several shorter visits. He was here in Champaran. So initially when the request was made by Rajkumar Shukla, the unlettered peasant, Gandhiji did not knew that 1 year of his life would be engaged in Champaran. The official inquiry assembled a crushing mountain of evidence against the big planters, and when they saw this, they agreed, in principle, to make refunds to the peasants. But how much must we pay? They asked Gandhi. So Gandhiji presented a heap of evidence before this commission, and the planters had to agree that they extracted a lot of money unlawfully from the poor peasants, and so they were agreeing to make refunds to the peasants, but how much they should pay, there was a deadlock on that. The Britishers, they were not willing to pay the total amount that they had taken from the peasants in the name of compensation. They thought he would demand repayment in full of the money which they had illegally and deceitfully extorted from the sharecroppers. He asked only 50%. There he seemed adamant, writes Reverend J. Z. Hodge, a British missionary in Champaran who observed the entire episode at close range. Thinking probably that he would not give way, the representative of the planters offered to refund to the extent of 25%, and to his amazement, Mr. Gandhi took him at his word, thus breaking the deadlock. So what happened? The British planters, they agreed that they should make refunds to the peasants, but they were not willing to pay 100% refund. And Gandhiji was initially adamant on 50%. He was asking that at least 50% of the compensation you must pay back to the peasants. So there was a deadlock. They were not able to reach to any consensus on that, how much money to be paid to the poor peasants. So there was a man, a respected J.Z. Hodge. He was a British missionary in Champaran, and he was observing this case from a close range. He was only an observer, and uh, he might have told this to Louis Fisher, that thinking probably that Gandhiji would not give way, would not consent to it, the representative of the planters, he offered to pay 25% of the compensation amount. And Gandhiji, to his amazement, to his surprise, accepted it. So one of the planter, the representative of the planters, he offered to pay 25%, thinking that Gandhiji would not agree to it. But Gandhiji agreed to it, and he said, okay, at least you pay 25% of the compensation that you have extorted from the poor peasants. So the deadlock was broken. This settlement was adopted unanimously by the commission. Gandhi explained that the amount of the refund was less important than the fact that the landlords had been obliged to surrender part of the money and with it part of their prestige. Therefore, as far as the peasants were concerned, the planters had behaved as lords above the law. Now the peasant saw that he had rights and defenders. He learned courage. So children, here you can see under think as you read, question number 1, the most important question from this chapter. Why did Gandhi agree to a settlement of 25% refund to the farmers? So Gandhiji agreed to 25% of refund because he wanted to make the planters realize that they could not always behave as lords above law. That law was equal for all the people. And they were not just surrendering part of the money, with that, they were also surrendering their prestige. This was the first time they were bowing before the peasants. All this time, they behaved as the owners of these peasants. So, for the first time, they had to bow down before the peasants, and peasants learned that they also had rights and they also had people like Gandhiji to defend them. So they learned courage out of this. So this is the most important question from this chapter, and to this you will write, on the one hand, he gave a good lesson to the planters who were behaving above law, and then he also imparted courage in the hearts of the Indian peasants who were earlier so much scared of the Britishers. So these 2 points you have to write. Events justified Gandhiji's position. Within a few years, the British planters abandoned their estates, which reverted to the peasants. Indian sharecropping disappeared. So Gandhiji was right in taking that decision, and Gandhiji was right in realizing that these Britishers they were also surrendering part of their prestige. So they felt so humiliated, so insulted that in 3-4 years they left the estates, they left the country, and they went back to England. And these estates, they reverted back to our Indian peasants. Our Indian peasants who were earlier sharecroppers, they were again made farmers. The land finally belonged to them. So that was the political and economic victory that Gandhiji gave to the poor peasants of Champaran. But Gandhiji did not leave Champaran after this victory. He stayed there because Gandhiji did not just want a political victory. He wanted to see social and cultural development in the area. So he stayed there for some more time to bring about cultural and social progress in the Champaran villages. He appealed for teachers Mahadev Desai and Narhari Parekh, 2 young men who had just joined Gandhi as disciples, and their wives volunteered for the work. Several more came from Bombay, Pune, and other distant parts of the land. Devdas, Gandhi's youngest son, arrived from the ashram. So did Mrs. Gandhi. Primary schools were opened in 6 villages. Kasturbai taught the ashram rules on personal cleanliness and community sanitation. So Gandhiji stayed there, seeing the backwardness of the place. He stayed there and he requested several teachers to volunteer their services for free in the villages of Champaran. And Mahadev Desai, Narhari Parekh, and several other teachers from Bombay, Pune, and other distant parts of the country, they came there. And Devdas, Gandhiji's youngest son, also arrived there. His wife Kasturbai also arrived there. And Gandhiji was able to open primary schools in 6 villages with the help of these teachers who volunteered their services. And Kasturbai also played a prominent role there. She taught the people about the importance of personal cleanliness and community sanitation, about health and hygiene. She taught the people. Health conditions were miserable. Gandhi got a doctor to volunteer his services for 6 months. 3 medicines were available: castor oil, quinine, and sulfur ointment. Anybody who showed a coated tongue was given a dose of castor oil. Anybody with malaria fever received quinine plus castor oil. Anybody with skin eruptions received ointment plus castor oil. So Gandhiji was also able to find a doctor to render his services for 6 months in this area, as Gandhiji found the health conditions to be miserable. And only 3 medicines were available with the doctor, and they were castor oil, quinine, and sulfur ointment. And if the patient showed a coated tongue, a problem with the tongue, then he or she was given castor oil. If the symptoms were that of malaria fever, then quinine and castor oil were given. And if somebody had a problem with the skin, then ointment and castor oil was given. So only with 3 medicines the doctor was treating the people. So the resources were scarce. And Gandhiji noticed the filthy state of women's clothes. He asked Kasturbai to talk to them about it. One woman took Kasturbai into her hut and said, "Look, there is no box or cupboard here for clothes. The sari I am wearing is the only one I have." So Gandhiji noticed that the women, they were not wearing tidy clothes. So he asked his wife to talk to these women about health and hygiene. So Kasturbai talked with these ladies, and one woman took Kasturbai to her hut, and she showed her the hut and said, "Look, there is no box, no cupboard, no almirah in the hut for clothes. The sari that I am wearing right now is the only one I have." So when you have only one set of clothes, then you cannot maintain its cleanliness. So through this, you can make out that the people of Champaran were very poor at that time. They did not have proper clothes to wear. During his long stay in Champaran, Gandhi kept a long distance watch on the ashram. He sent regular instructions by mail and asked for financial accounts. Once he wrote to the residents that it was time to fill in the old latrine trenches and dig new ones, otherwise the old ones would begin to smell bad. So here also we can see the good leadership qualities of Gandhiji, his vision. So all the time he was occupied with the work going on in Champaran, but he never forgot about the ashram. So from time to time he sent instructions by mail to the ashram. He asked for the financial accounts, and once he also wrote to the residents that it was time to fill the old latrine trenches and dig new ones, because the old ones would begin to smell bad as they would be full by then. So you can see the vision of Gandhiji. He was able to envisage that this must have been the condition of the latrine trenches, and he gave instructions likewise. So such was the greatness of Gandhiji, that though he was busy, totally busy and engrossed with the work in hand in Champaran, but he never lost sight of his ashram in Gujarat. The Champaran episode was a turning point in Gandhi's life. What I did, he explained, was a very ordinary thing. I declared that the British could not order me about in my own country. Children, this particular sentence, the Champaran episode was a turning point in Gandhi's life. This comes as a long answer type question and is the most important question not only from this chapter but the entire book Flamingo. So you should prepare it thoroughly. Why did Gandhiji consider the Champaran episode to be a turning point in his life? So here you will explain what was the Champaran episode, and then you would explain that through this experience Gandhiji became sure that the Britishers were there to exploit the people of India. They were not there for the welfare of the citizens of India. So it was time to urge them to leave the country. Gandhiji told Louis Fisher that what he did in Champaran was a very ordinary thing. He made it clear to the Britishers that they were nobody to order an Indian in their own country. But Champaran did not begin as an act of defiance. It grew out of an attempt to alleviate the distress of large numbers of poor peasants. This was a typical Gandhi pattern. His politics were intertwined with the practical day to day problems of the millions. His was not a loyalty to abstractions, it was a loyalty to living human beings. In everything Gandhi did, moreover, he tried to mold a new free Indian who could stand on his own feet and thus make India free. So Gandhiji was of the opinion that what he did in Champaran, it was not an act of defiance. It was not an act of disobedience of the British government. It was an act to alleviate the distress of large number of poor peasants. It was an act to help the poor people of Champaran to come out of their problems. So this was the typical Gandhian policy. His politics was always intertwined, was always mixed with the practical day to day problems of the millions. So, even after resolving the political or the economic issue there, he stayed there because he felt that the people were still in problem as they were culturally and socially backward. So, he stayed there. His was not a loyalty to abstractions. Gandhiji was not loyal to some rigid principles. He was loyal to living human beings and he wanted to help the living human beings and not to follow any principles as such. So, what he did in Champaran was out of humanity and it was his effort to help his fellow Indians to lead a free life. So, whatever Gandhiji did, he tried to mold the character of everyone into a new free Indian so that India could emerge as a free country. So, in the end, another incident is given wherein Gandhiji taught self reliance to his friends. So, let's read it. Early in the Champaran action, Charles Freyr Andrews, the English pacifist who had become a devoted follower of the Mahatma, came to bid Gandhi farewell before going on a tour of duty to the Fiji Islands. Gandhi's lawyer friends thought it would be a good idea for Andrews to stay in Champaran and help them. Andrews was willing if Gandhi agreed. But Gandhi was vehemently opposed. He said, "You think that in this unequal fight it would be helpful if we have an Englishman on our side? This shows the weakness of your heart. The cause is just, and you must rely upon yourselves to win the battle. You should not seek a prop in Mr. Andrews because he happens to be an Englishman." He had read our minds correctly, Rajendra Prasad comments, and we had no reply. Gandhi in this way taught us a lesson in self reliance. So there was a Britisher His name was Charles Frere Andrews, and he was an English pacifist. Though he was an Englishman, but he was a pacifist. Pacifist means a person who does not want war or uh, two parties confronting each other. A pacifist always looks for peace, how to bring about peace between the two parties. So, Charles Frere Andrews, he was a follower of Mahatma, and he came to see Mahatma Gandhi as he was going to Fiji Islands. And Gandhi's lawyer friends, they thought that if Andrews stayed in Champaran and helped them with the case, that would be great. And Andrews was also willing to stay there and help them if Gandhiji wanted so. But Gandhiji was totally against it. He told his friends that why do you want to take the help of Charles Frere Andrews simply because he is an Englishman, and as we are fighting against Britishers, you feel that if one Britisher stay by our side, then we can easily win the battle. Why don't you trust your own self? Why can't you be self dependent, self reliant? Our cause is just, we are fighting for the right cause, then why should we be worried about anything else? Why do we need the help of any Britisher? So Gandhiji was able to read the mind of his lawyer friends correctly, and he gave them a lesson in self-reliance. He taught them self-reliance, that we Indians were self-sufficient to fight for our cause, and we do not need the help of any Britisher. So, self reliance, Indian independence, and help to sharecroppers were all bound together. So, this was Gandhiji's policy. You can say he wanted the Indians to be self reliant, and he wanted to help the sharecroppers there in Champaran, and in a way, he wanted to take the country towards independence. So, this is the chapter Indigo, children. I hope it is clear to you. Rest of it we will discuss in the online class. Thank you.